Hello, everyone, and welcome to this virtual workshop on systematic reviews. My name is Joanna Thielen. My pronouns are she, her. I am one of the engineering librarians that works at the Art, Architecture, and Engineering Library in the Duderstadt Center on North Campus. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to be talking all things systematic reviews, and we are very lucky to have with us Whitney Townsend, who is an informationist at the Taubman Health Sciences Library, and she's one of the Library's experts in this methodology. So a few logistics before we get started. Please feel free to use the chat throughout if you have questions or comments. We'll also have a Q&A session at the end where you can use the chat or unmute yourself if you would like. We are in a Zoom meeting, so please keep your mics muted throughout. And we will be recording this session, and later this week we will be sharing the recording as well as the slides with everyone who is registered for this workshop. Also, if you have any questions or comments or just would like have some help about using the library, you can email the engineering librarians, and my colleague Jamie has put that email address in the chat. We are here to help, so we are happy to answer any questions you may have. And without further ado, take it away, Whitney.
All right, thanks so much, Joanna, and thank you all for having me here today. So as Joanna said, my name is Whitney Townsend. I'm one of the informationists at the Taubman Health Sciences Library. I've been working with teams on systematic reviews for about 13 plus years or so, and I'm an instructor in our systematic reviews for librarians workshop that we put on a few times a year through University of Michigan Library. So today I'm here to kind of give you a 30,000-foot overview of systematic reviews, as well as some related review methodologies, to really give you an idea of what they are, what they aren't, and whether they are the right review design for your research, for your work, things like that. Okay, so I would encourage you after this session, if you have questions, we will have some Q&A time for sure, but also reach out to your librarians, to your informationists if you have additional questions or are thinking of starting a project that is a systematic review or is a similar review methodology. And I'll talk a little bit about the end about how you can get a hold of us and work with a search expert on your project. Okay, so let's go ahead and roll in here. So today I'm planning on talking to you about what a systematic review is, as well as what it isn't, as I mentioned. And then we'll talk about specific systematic review methods or the methodology that goes into systematic reviews, because it is a term that gets thrown around a lot, okay? And you'll see it attached to a lot of different publications. And when we really look at it, many of these papers are not actually systematic reviews. A systematic review is a specific research methodology, okay? And if a paper does not meet that methodology, is not technically a systematic review. So we'll talk about what those methods are so that you can recognize a systematic review and determine if it's the right review typology essentially for you. So what kind of review is right for you and your research and the questions that you're trying to answer. And then we'll wrap up with working with the librarian and some kind of tips that can make our partnership go smoothly. Okay? All right, so first off, I think it's important to think about what a systematic review is, okay? Again, terminology that gets thrown around a lot everywhere, okay? We saw systematic reviews primarily get started and really gain a foothold in medicine, which is where my background is. But it is a methodology, okay, a research methodology, so it can be applied across disciplines. Okay, but there are important components of systematic review methods that need to be followed regardless of the discipline that you're in. Okay, so we've got a few of the major definitions. This is a very wordy, very texty slide, so we're not going to read all of it. But this first definition comes from the Cochrane collaboration, which was one of the first major research groups to devote themselves to conducting systematic reviews, in this case in medicine and health sciences. Okay, and their definition of a systematic review identifies what the review is designed to do. okay? And it tries to identify, appraise, and synthesize all of the evidence that meets pre-specified eligibility criteria to answer a specific research question, okay? Using explicit methods that are designed to minimize bias, okay? We can also see the definition from the Campbell collaboration, which is one of the large research groups in the social sciences that conducts systematic reviews. And you'll see a lot of similarities in this definition to what we saw from the Cochrane collaboration. Okay, answers predefined questions, sums up the best available research evidence on a specific question, transparent procedures in finding, evaluating, and synthesizing results of that research. Can be replicated. Again, we're trying to minimize bias. That is the intention here. Okay. And there are other groups. Joanna Briggs Institute is the primary nursing and allied health group. There are many other evidence syntheses groups out there across disciplines that have definitions of what a systematic review is. But there are a few characteristics that all of these definitions share. Okay. First is that there is a clear, predefined research question. Okay, so systematic reviews tend to be quite focused in their research questions. All right, it's not sort of everything about a topic, what's out there. It is, this is our very specific question, and we are going to identify studies that answer this very specific question. Second component here is that there's a systematic and comprehensive search for studies. So this is not, I just went and did a literature search and grabbed a few studies. This is, I went and tried to find everything, okay, in a systematic way through multiple databases, things like that, that are appropriate to the question that you're asking, all right? Third, there are explicit inclusion and exclusion criteria, again, predefined. Predefined is a theme that goes through all of this, right? For including studies. So they need to meet certain criteria to be included. Okay. Next, we see that there's quality appraisal for all included studies. And this is one where you'll see a lot of things labeled as a systematic review where they stumble. Okay. It is a requirement for systematic review methodology, whatever discipline you are in, that there be a quality appraisal for included studies. Okay, so if they randomized, did they randomize properly? If they didn't randomize at all, that introduces potential bias, right? A risk of bias, those kinds of things. And so that appraisal is different depending on the study design that you're looking at and the field that you're working in, but it has to happen for it to be a systematic review. And then finally, combining and synthesizing the results of those studies. So not just presenting individual studies, but saying, what can we say about the results of all these studies combined together, and how does that answer our predefined question? Okay? And going through all of these things, okay, is an expectation of transparency and that the process be replicable, okay? So that anybody else could go through the same process that you did. All right, so just like any good study, right, we should be able to look at the methods and reproduce them and be transparently reporting what we did and how we did it so that can be done. Okay, so these are the hallmarks of a systematic review. Okay, so in a practical sense, what does that actually look like? And here's an example from the health sciences and actually from the Cochrane collaboration, who we referenced their definition earlier. So the question that we have in this particular case is looking at knee length versus thigh length compression stockings for preventing deep vein thrombosis, DVTs, blood clots after surgery. Okay, so there was this question that said, well, okay, great. We have knee length compression stockings. We also have thigh length compression stockings. Which of these is better for preventing post-surgical blood clots? So the first step then is to go out. We have our defined question now. So now they went out and found every study that had ever been done, theoretically, on this question. Okay, and we can see the studies down here at the bottom. Excuse me, individual studies on that question. Okay, so we have 3 in this particular example right here. Randomized clinical trial here, thigh length versus knee length stockings, and another on cost effectiveness and efficacy of below the knee versus above the knee compression stockings, etc. So the idea here is we have multiple individual studies that have been conducted on this topic. So what is the answer to this question? Well, we can combine these studies, the results of these studies, to try to answer that question to the best of our ability, because oftentimes studies will have slightly different findings, even if they're on the same question. So really what we're saying is when we put all of this evidence together on this question, what are our findings? Okay, so then we have the final publication here from Cochrane, where they attempt to answer that question. All right. Now, I think one of the things you also need to keep in mind when we're talking about what is a systematic review in a practical sense is that combination, that synthesis of the results of these individual studies. And that is important because you cannot combine studies that are quite different from each other. They need to be similar enough. The question needs to be focused enough that you can reasonably combine the results of them. So for example, if compression stockings, if you've ever used compression socks or stockings, they can have like different amounts of compression in them. Okay, so is it fair to compare, you know, a very loosely compressed compression stocking with a very tightly compressed compression stocking? Right? Probably not, because they're kind of fundamentally different things, right? So this is where something called subgroup analyses can come in. All right, so we may look at this question, and then within the results, they may parse out studies that look at different compression stocking weight or something like that. But the idea here is that they need to be similar enough that it makes sense to combine them, okay? Because it may not make sense to combine things that are different. Or if we think of it, again, I'm using a medical example, but I'm sure you can imagine examples in your fields, a particular drug, right? For, let's say, for migraines. Well, I can't necessarily combine the results for this drug taken orally at a certain, you know, in a pill form, at a certain strength, right, or dosage. I can't necessarily combine that with the same drug maybe being taken intravenously, right, at a different strength. They're not really quite the same thing, so they can't necessarily have their results be combined. All right, so that's kind of one of the other points here, is that the studies in a systematic review must be similar enough, both in their design, okay, so what is the study design, and the characteristics to reasonably combine them together, because that's what we're trying to do here, is we're trying to get a higher level of evidence by combining the results. Okay, so how are we doing so far? I can't see everybody's faces here, but feel free to write questions into the chat. We've got folks that will give me a quick yell and alert me and let me know. Okay, I got a thumbs up from Joanna. Awesome. Okay, so also in a practical sense, what is a systematic review? It is also a significant, takes significant resources, okay? So when we talk about what a systematic review is in a practical sense of what is the resourcing you're going to need, most systematic reviews, this is where it's a little shock for many folks, most systematic reviews are generally going to take about 1 to 2 years to complete. Okay, you need at least, and we'll talk about the why in a moment, 2 members on your systematic review team, oftentimes more than 2. All right, and the results of your literature searches, because they are designed to be very comprehensive and find everything out there on your topic. That means they're going to find a lot of things that aren't on your topic. Okay, that's what they're supposed to do. Okay, but what that means is that you will be screening through hundreds to oftentimes more like thousands of citations to get down to the final studies that you're actually going to include in your review. Okay, so it is a significant commitment of resources. They are not review designs to undertake lightly. So this isn't me trying to scare you, but it is me trying to be a little bit of a reality check here. And you'll see why when we talk about some of the systematic review methods. We'll also talk about some alternatives if this isn't quite what you want to do. All right. So I'm going to stop for just a moment here and also say that if you are faculty, if you are an instructor, if you are in a position where you have students that you are creating assignments for and projects for and things like that, a lot of times this sounds like a very appealing project to have students do. Okay, because like, hey, it's great. Like you learn how to come up with a good question, you search the literature and you have to get kind of good at it. And then you have to screen through all these papers and you really like learn a lot by doing that. And that is true, you do, but as you can see, when done correctly, a systematic review takes a lot of resourcing, a lot of skill, and a lot of expertise that is generally not going to be reasonable to ask of students, okay? For that reason, if you don't take anything else away from today's presentation, please do not assign students a systematic review as a project. It can be great for them to look at existing systematic reviews on topics. Okay, it can be a wonderful exercise for them to go through the process of putting together a protocol for a systematic review, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. General literature reviews that don't require this level of rigor are awesome. Annotated bibliographies where they look through the literature, summarize the findings, things like that, are wonderful projects. But please do not assign students to do a systematic review as a project in a semester or something like that. Talk to your librarian, and we will, work with you to come up with a great project that's more reasonably scoped to students' skills and their available time. Okay, so that's my soapbox moment. I'll go ahead and get off that soapbox right now. Okay, so what else isn't a systematic review? Okay, we talked about what they are, but again, you'll hear this term thrown around a lot, but oftentimes attached to things that are actually narrative reviews, and that's that traditional review article that we tend to think about. Okay, and we've got some of the differences between the two right here. So, we can see in the first line the hypothesis or the question. So I talked about how systematic reviews really require to have a pretty clearly defined, fairly narrow question where we expect all the studies on that question would have similar results. Okay, narrative reviews are oftentimes, kind of a broader topic, and that's great. They both serve important purposes, but they are very different things. Okay, the search in a systematic review, which is the part that I and the other librarians are oftentimes going to be involved in, is defined in the protocol. Okay, it is systematic, it is comprehensive, it uses multiple databases and requires a high level of expertise. Inclusion of studies, again, predefined selection criteria based on the protocol and the author's hypothesis or the question in systematic reviews, whereas narrative reviews, it's really the authors kind of picking what they want to include. And you can see that there are many other differences between systematic reviews and narrative reviews right here. And you'll see more as we talk about the specific method points in the systematic review process. Okay, but I would say keep these things in mind as you're looking through review articles, especially things that call themselves systematic reviews, to identify whether they really are or not. Now, the other, I think, terminology challenge is the difference between a systematic review and a systematic search. Okay, so a systematic search is something that we in the library do all the time and are happy to teach folks how to do themselves, which is great. And systematic searches is just the process of, systematically searching, identifying your databases, crafting a search that you're using in each of them, things like that. A systematic review, as you saw, is a research methodology that includes a systematic search as part of it, okay, but has a lot of other components as well. And we can see that a systematic search in and of itself can be useful in a variety of different types of projects and research designs, whether that's the systematic review. You'll see plenty of narrative reviews that will use a systematic search. It's just the rest of the methods, they're following a narrative review method. There are a lot of other review types. We'll talk about a couple later in the session. Book chapters, you've got to do a really good look through the literature when you're writing those. Grant applications, the list really goes on. So that's the difference between the systematic search, which is the process of conducting a great search in various databases on the question or questions, sometimes it's multiple topic that you're looking at, versus the systematic review, which is that question, search, screening, appraisal, synthesis, results process. All right. Okay, so we talked about what it is. Let's talk a little bit about the specific methods, the specific process points within a systematic review to be aware of. Okay, and again, these can help you determine whether this is the right review design for your project, for your research, or whether you'd be better suited to something else. All right, so let's talk about these really quickly. And I think you always need to ask yourself whether you really want to do a systematic review or not. Okay, we talked about the fact that they are time and resource intensive. Okay, and there's a lot you need to learn if you haven't done one before. And I like to say that a systematic review, really any research methodology, is similar to a recipe, right? You have steps to follow, but there's a lot of leeway within each of those steps. So really, if I like watching the Great British Baking Show or Bake Off or whatever you like to call it. And if you're familiar with the show, the second challenge that they have is called a technical challenge. And everybody gets the same technical challenge, right? The same ingredients and things like that. And what they are given then is the name of this thing that they need to make and very sort of bare bones steps for how to do so. Okay, and so it requires that the contestants have generally a pretty high level of experience and understanding of how to do many of the techniques that are involved in baking these things. Okay, so systematic review, similar to a technical challenge, we're going to go through these steps, but know that there is a lot of nuance within each of them that can lead you to either a very great result or something that's kind of a disaster. All right, but fortunately we have a lot of resources and support for you if this is what you end up deciding to undertake. Okay, so if you've ever watched this show, you know, sometimes the extent of the instructions for one part might be like make the dough. Okay, there's a lot that goes into making the dough, right? If you're experienced, that might be easy. If you're not so much, that can be challenging. So same thing with like, can do a literature search. There's a lot that goes into that, okay? All right, so let's take a look at what this looks like step by step. All right, now much like those technical challenges, it looks pretty linear when you look at the steps here. So steps in a systematic review is you define your question, okay? You develop a protocol. We'll talk a little bit about this. So that's your predefined criteria, all right? Conduct your literature search, select your studies, appraise those studies, extract, so for the studies that make it all the way through, extract your data and analyze it, and then present your results. All right, sounds pretty straightforward, right? But the reality, of course, is usually not nearly as linear as this, okay? This is an image that I like from 2014 from the Systematic Reviews Journal. There's a whole journal on systematic review methodology called Systematic Reviews. They're great. But this is a little more what it really looks like. There's a lot of back and forth and it gets a little tangled, okay? So we can see that you have sort of all these different classifications of what you're doing, preparing, retrieving the articles, appraising them, synthesizing them, writing them up. There's a lot of steps in here. And they happen at different times, and sometimes you have to backtrack and things like that. So just keep in mind it is not a nice linear process, as most research isn't. But there's some key points to be aware of when we're talking about systematic reviews specifically. And I know the text here is a little bit teeny, but you will get these slides coming out as well. So please feel free to refer back to them. So one of the first key points is that literature search. And so the expectation for the literature search is that multiple databases and other information sources like grade literature, technical bulletins, things like that will be searched, including hand searching, things like tracking references and things like that. Okay, you'll be using appropriate search terms, both controlled vocabulary and keyword, customized to each database that you're running your searches in. And this is where we, the librarians, oftentimes will partner with you. Okay. You also need to identify any limits that you're applying onto your search filters you may use, things like that. If you decide to limit your search to English language only publications because you say to yourself, maybe I only can read English, you have to be aware that the point of the systematic review is to minimize bias as much as possible. If you limit your search to only English language publications, you are potentially introducing a language bias here. Okay, there may be some great articles that are written in other languages. If you can't read them, you can use translation services or oftentimes just use Google Translate to get enough of an idea from the abstract whether it's something that you care about or not. Okay, whether it would fit your criteria. So again, we want to walk away from introducing potential biases at every step that we can through the process. All right. Okay, second step is the study selection. So now we have all these citations from the literature search. You need to systematically go through and screen all of the citations that come back. It's usually thousands. Okay, be ready for that. And two people need to screen all of the results blinded from each other to decide whether a particular paper is relevant or not. Okay, so again, attempting to reduce bias by having two people screening each citation. There also need to be very clearly defined inclusion and exclusion criteria. So what population are you looking at? Things like that. Okay. Next step then is that study appraisal. Again, at least you'll see a theme here. Two people appraising all articles blinded from each other. So this is looking at the quality level. We only want to let the good quality studies through here. Okay. And they need to assess the risk of bias in each of these studies using predefined criteria. So this is usually some kind of rubric. There are many that have been developed to look at different kinds of study designs to help evaluate the risk of bias and the quality level of the articles. Okay, so in medicine, a very common one that's used is called GRADE, G-R-A-D-E. It's looking primarily at randomized control trials and evaluating risk of bias within each individual study. Okay, to see like, okay, are we pooling the results of some kind of sketchy studies? Are we pooling the results of very good studies? What are we putting together here? Then we get to the data extraction and analysis point. Again, at least two people independently extracting the data, using a standardized form. So everybody's pulling out the same information. And that's the point then that you can conduct a qualitative synthesis. So qualitatively, narratively summarizing the findings of the articles. And if possible, a quantitative synthesis. Okay, that's a meta-analysis. When you actually pool the data, the results from all of the studies and rerun a statistical analysis on them, that is your quantitative synthesis or your meta-analysis. Sometimes you can do that, a lot of times you can't. Studies are too dissimilar, things like that. You may not be able to do that, okay? And then finally, presenting the results, you need to report all those, your process according to PRISMA, which is the preferred reporting standards for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, as well as other review designs. We'll take a look at that shortly. And then include appropriate information such that the study could be replicated, things like that. Okay, so this is a lot of information. I'm going to do a really quick pause here and see if there are any questions about these key points in systematic review methods. So again, you can toss it in the chat, you can unmute and ask, whatever works best for you. Okay, I'm not hearing anything, so on we go. All right. So I mentioned standards and methods and that there are a lot of resources that help support, that can help support you if you decide to do a systematic review and that you should be aware of, quite frankly. At the Taubman Library, if you work with any of us on your review, we have sort of our required readings that we will send you ahead of time and say you need to be familiar with this before we talk, and then we can move ahead, okay? These aren't all of our required readings here, but we have different things depending on your review design. But the first one that you should be aware of is PRISMA, okay? And you can, just Google PRISMA systematic reviews. It's easy, it'll come up. PRISMA is the reporting standards, okay? So this is telling you when you actually write up your paper, what should be included in the paper, okay? I want to be clear, these are reporting standards. It's not a methods guideline. Okay, it's not telling you how to do it. It's just telling you what you need to tell us. Okay, so you could report a terrible literature search and you'd still be compliant with Prisma because you reported it. Might have been terrible, but you said what it was. So now when we want to talk more about methods standards, there are several places to look, and this is going to be discipline specific. So I've listed a few of the big ones that are used in health sciences and social sciences. A lot of the content in them can be certainly extrapolated into other fields as well. So don't be afraid to look at them if you're not within the health sciences, but also take a look and see what you have in your field. So the first one is the IOM Institute of Medicine. It's called Finding What Works in Healthcare, but it's really their systematic review guidelines of how to conduct a systematic review. And I find that one to be quite a good balance between providing enough information, but not completely overwhelming you or being really, really specific for a specific method. So for example, Cochrane handbook, so Cochrane Collaboration, they create their own systematic reviews. So their handbook is very useful to look at. They have generally been kind of considered the gold standard of systematic reviews. But they have their way of doing things that not everybody is resourced to do. So again, it's always a little bit of a give and take and an adaptation. Campbell Collaboration, as I mentioned, is social sciences. Joanna Briggs is nursing and allied health. Okay, and we'll talk a little about our guide later, but there are many guides from in other disciplines. Okay, so I'm not going to go too far into the rest of that because that's a whole other workshop in and of itself. But if you are considering a systematic review as a research method for a particular project or question that you have, I can't recommend enough that you start with a protocol. Okay, just like many other studies, a protocol is your plan to get you started. Prisma has an extension, like a checklist for protocols, and they will tell you exactly what should be in your protocol. Okay, and while it's a reporting standard, again, telling you what to tell us, it also gives you a lot of great information and kind of a framework of how you're going to build your review. All right, so things like the point there in the introduction, the rationale, that's an important part. Describe the rationale for the review in the context of what is already known. Why are you doing this? Why is it important? Okay, we can see in the screenshot here as we move down into some of the methods and the information sources, present a draft of the search strategy to be used for at least one electronic database. So as you go through, data management, how are you going to manage your citations and information? It's going to allow you to kind of plot out every step of the way and make sure that you're prepared both with the knowledge that you need to be able to successfully complete that step and the resources. So sometimes that means software, sometimes that means do you have enough people on your team, how long is this going to take, things like that. We have gotten a lot in the Taubman library, at least, have gotten a lot stricter isn't quite the word, but we really, if we're going to go all in on working on a review with you, we expect there to be a protocol. Okay, if there isn't, hey, let's work on getting one together. But the expectation is that that will happen. Okay, and if you are finding it challenging to complete the protocol, to be honest, then you may not be ready yet for the full systematic review. Okay, but it will get you set and get you there. Okay, so far I've talked about systematic reviews and possibly scared you a little, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there are a lot of review designs out there. So the same way that I mentioned that systematic reviews are a specific method, not just sort of a word that gets thrown around, although it does. There are other review designs, a lot of them, that use specific methods. And depending on what your question is, what you're trying to answer, and the characteristics of your topic one of these other reviews that again is very structured, just a different method, might actually be best for you. So let's take a look at some of these. So a lot of review designs. I see new ones popping up all the time. And terminology has kind of changed and shifted with these over the years. So, previously there sort of used to be the systematic review umbrella, which would cover your qualitative systematic review. That would be where the results are qualitatively or narratively summarized, and quantitative systematic reviews. So that would be your qualitative systematic review plus meta-analysis. And then there was kind of like the umbrella of other reviews. So narrative, your standard narrative reviews, scoping reviews, realist reviews, all kinds of other reviews. That's kind of how they were viewed. And I think, I know, things have shifted in the terminology and kind of the consideration of these different review designs. So now really I would say the umbrella is kind of evidence syntheses overall, okay? And I would say kind of systematic or structured evidence syntheses is this larger umbrella here, which really, all these kind of structured methods fall underneath, from your qualitative and quantitative systematic reviews, but also scoping reviews have very specific methods that you follow. Okay, narrative reviews are still a little bit looser and not necessarily considered to be a systematic synthesis of evidence, but many of these others are. And again, narrative reviews, have a great place in the literature and are very important. Okay, so lots of different options here. And I think when you're considering what you want to do, you need to think about a couple important questions. Okay, so the first thing is, what's the function of the particular review type you're considering? Like, what kind of problem does it solve? What kinds of questions is it designed to answer? All right. And then what are the characteristics of that review type? Like, what are the methods? What's the actual methodology? So we talked about systematic review methodology a bit. What are the steps, right, in that particular review type? So, all these different review designs have really sprung up because there are limitations to systematic reviews. In the same way that the systematic reviews sprung up because there were limitations of the narrative review, right? It was not sort of systematic enough for synthesizing the evidence the way it was needed. So a few of the limitations of systematic reviews include scope. Systematic reviews are designed to answer very narrow questions, as we've discussed, okay, where all studies are going to come to a similar, you would expect them to come to a similar conclusion, right? Similar results. But oftentimes we have questions that are a little broader than that, that are a little more exploratory. So that can't really be answered nicely by a systematic review that way, because it would scope so huge, right? Also, systematic reviews really focus on quantitative results and synthesis. So even when we talk about qualitative systematic reviews, the qualitative refers to how the results are synthesized, or summarized. They're done narratively, but they're still looking at quantitative studies, the quantitative primary research. Okay. And then 3, timeliness is a big issue. I talked about 1 year to 2 years to complete these systematic reviews, right? So by the time it gets published, usually do a search update or something like that. But they can get a little old, right? They're important because a lot of work's gone into them, but they are never going to be like right at the cutting edge, right? So a couple major review designs that you'll see that are quite popular because they address question number 1, the question of scope, and they address question number 3, the question of timeliness in systematic reviews, which I think are some of the biggest barriers sometimes for folks using them for their research methods. So the first one is called a scoping review. You may have heard of these, also called, closely related mapping reviews, things like that. And they are really good for kind of larger topics where the literature may be different from each other, maybe heterogeneous, okay? It's not a super precise question necessarily. And the intention is really more to map the existing literature. So the inclusion-exclusion criteria might not be so narrow of like only this one study design, will we include. It may be more of a map of like, well, we found this many studies using this design, and this many studies using this design, and this many studies using this design. So it's really trying to get the scope, right, of the literature available on the topic, and identify gaps, identify definitions and conceptual boundaries, kind of help cluster within this broader topic what the subtopics may be. Okay, and we've got some resources linked down here if you're interested in exploring more. JBI, the Joanna Briggs Institute, has an outstanding manual on scoping reviews that is wonderful. And then the second one addresses that timeliness question, and that's a rapid review. And again, you'll hear these called a few different things, but they're great for new and emerging research, okay? Critical topics, things like that. The idea is essentially that you're using the same process of a systematic review, but in a very short time frame, and removing some of the steps that are designed to minimize bias. So there's a recognition that there's a potential for more bias here, but we're removing some of those steps in order to get it done quicker, frankly. Okay, so it may be a limited search rather than searching 6 databases. Maybe we only search 1 or 2. Okay, a single person may go through and screen, you know, all the citations or things like that, which introduces selection bias and other kinds of things. And then they can still synthesize either narratively or quantitatively, depending. So the idea is just to try to streamline the same steps that you would go through for a systematic review for the most part. Okay, so all those places where you had 2 people screening, it may just be 1, you know, or things may be single screened, that kind of thing. And again, a few links here to give you some information if you're interested. So you may be thinking right now, I have no idea, Whitney, what I want to do anymore. There are a number of resources, including your librarians, that are happy to talk to you about what review is right for you. And again, this link, Cornell has a lovely flow chart, and it's linked in the slides here, so you'll get that. That's basically, you just go through and what review is right for you, and gives you some ideas of possible review designs. And then on the right-hand side is a sort of little website that you can go to. It is pretty focused on the health sciences, I will say that now, okay? But it's called What Review is Right for You, and you can just sort of go through and answer the questions, and they will suggest possible methods. And the last thing that I just find this publication incredibly useful, and I send it out to people all the time. It's called Meeting the Review Family, Exploring Review Types and Associated Information Retrieval Requirements, which is, you know, the library, information retrieval. This is just an outstanding overview of different review designs and the methods associated with them. So I highly recommend that you take a look at this if you are thinking, gosh, maybe systematic review isn't quite right. But there are lots of other rigorous review designs that might fit your topic better. Or again, if you're looking for that student, you know, project or something, like what do we have here that might fit their resourcing better? Okay, so working with a librarian, obviously we do a lot of the work on the search aspects of things, and also can help point you to resources that you need to address the other steps in the systematic review process. So, you know, from the search standpoint, you may think like, hey, I do a lot of searching. I'm pretty good at the Google, whatever. I know how to search. I will say, I'm actually just going to jump down to the third point here, which is systematic review searching is like a very different animal, even from your standard database searching, because of the requirements for replicability and comprehensiveness. We have to do a lot of fancy librarian things, or not just librarian things, but fancy search things. Okay, so I'm always going to recommend that you check in with a librarian, even if it's just to take a look at what you've done. There have been multiple studies that show that librarian co-authored systematic reviews have much better quality retrieval and reporting in the literature. And, you know, let's move on to these. The search is the foundation of the review. If you do not find studies, your review is fundamentally flawed. I mean, if you think of the validity of your review, you know, as like Jenga, right? Each of these little blocks is a study. If these are the studies that are out there, if you're missing some of those studies, you didn't find them in the literature search, the validity of your review is just kind of like in shambles. Okay, the whole thing can fall down if you are missing important data. All right. Searches can look a lot different. This is just looking at a COVID-19 search, and these numbers are from very early in the pandemic. They have gone up astronomically since then. But if you just run a search, say in PubMed for COVID-19, we get what we have on the left here. We got about 1,100 results, something like that. If we look on the right, you can see all the ways that, or not even all the ways, that COVID-19 is actually referred to in the literature. Okay, a lot of different ways, all right, which over doubles the number of citations that come back, and that number would only be even larger now. So this is why you want to have a nice, robust search to make sure you're finding everything. Okay. Now, finally, we have a guide, our systematic review guide, that has a lot of the resources that I've talked about today in our session, as well as additional resources that can help you determine whether a systematic review is the design for you, as well as resources that support each of those steps in the systematic review process. All right. We talk about citation management there, reporting standards, systematic review softwares. There are specific softwares that are designed to work you through that process that really make it a lot easier. So feel free to visit our guide and get information there, but also reach out to your librarian. Okay, so the link on here will help you contact your subject librarian. You can also just go to the library website and search for us. But a few things that help us a lot when you send us that message that says, hey, I want to do a systematic review or a scoping review or whatever, be ready to review the standards. So like the Prisma standards, the IOM handbook, things like that, whatever is relevant for your discipline. You don't have to have reviewed all of it before you talk to us, but just be ready to, okay? Especially if it's your first, systematic review rodeo. Again, there's a lot to learn. We want to put you in that best, position for that technical challenge, so that you have all the knowledge you need to go out and execute, right? It's helpful if you have a draft protocol or even just sort of an outline, of what you're planning on doing for the review. It helps us a lot to help you scope and start developing searches. You should also know who's on your team, okay? Because it cannot be a team of one. It just can't, both for bias reasons, but also because it is an incredible amount of work, okay? And then it's also helpful to us if you understand that crafting that search takes time and expertise. We will not make you a search in 2 hours. It oftentimes will take a couple weeks and back and forth and discussion to be able to put together an appropriate search and translate it into all the different databases that you need to search to successfully do a systematic review.